Hi everybody, this is Nahaz and this is my first ever video. I did a show on 686 patch analysis with Toby and some others the other night. We got into talking for a very long time and I didn't feel like we did a very good job of sort of giving our overarching views of what we thought of the patch and where it was going to take the meta. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit, I'm going to try to be a little bit less long-winded here and give you kind of a bird's eye view of where I think we're going. Just for context, I think when you look at a new patch, you've got to understand how the meta got to where it is right now. The first thing I'll observe is that junglers were virtually absent from the game in 6.85. This was in both pubs and pros. And I think it started after the TI4 meta when the death balls were really nerfed. The global glyph changes were added to tier 1 towers. And the chief benefit of junglers, which was early pushing, was really de-emphasized. And what we've seen in the previous two metas in 684 and 85 is that it's really, most teams have thought that it's a lot more efficient to stack camps early and give them to like a flash farming SF or Storm Spirit or Leshrac than it was to have a Chen with an early mech. And you really saw this take shape in the junglers were in less than 10% of pro matches in 6.85. Most of the jungling setups had a pretty poor win rate. And really, I think this link, by the way, requires Dota Buff Plus, so I may change that in the final version of the slides. You can find a link to these slides below in the comments. Only 12 heroes had any jungling presence whatsoever in 6.85 pubs, and if memory serves, I think only 2 of them had positive win rates. So junglers were really not a thing at all. The support meta had really stagnated quite a bit. 4 of the 5 most picked pro heroes since November 1st were supports. We were starting to see not much variety at that particular position, and we're also seeing the 4 position meta just completely stagnate. What you saw from AUI 2000 in particular over the summer with sort of the more greedy farming support setups, that was becoming less and less common. A lot of people said, for example, around Frankfurt that Crit was actually a fairly greedy support, which is not true at all. He only takes 13% of OG's farm on average, where Fly takes 10. So most teams, you were seeing the 2 supports kind of becoming a little bit more homogeneous in their farm distribution, and you were seeing a lot less hero variety. One good thing that I thought in 6.85 is that the offlane meta opened up substantially from 6.84. 6.84 was all about these very defensive offlaners like your Clockwork and Earthshaker that could just keep the lane back and soak EXP, and that's a trend that I think is going to continue in 6.86. And a final comment that I'll make is the faction advantage situation at the end of 6.5 was really strange in that Radiant dominated pubs completely. Dota Buff released some very nice statistics, and a lot of people on Reddit noticed that every single hero, 110 out of 110 heroes in 6.85, had a higher pub win rate on Radiant than on Dire. At the same time, at the pro level, Knoxville and I did some work over the summer that really suggested that in the beginning of last year, top teams were picking Radiant and were just out farming. And as the year took shape, going through TI and afterward, you saw Dire teams, first of all, become more aggressive early, and second, put a lot more focus on neutralizing that Radiant jungle. So you'd see, for example, toward the end of the year, teams were routinely teleporting to the bottom tier 1 tower as Dire to ward up the Radiant jungle. And once that Radiant pull camp gets warded, which is very easy to do, the Radiant team is at a lot less of an early advantage. So what you saw was that Dire went almost 60% win rate since November 1st, and that includes the matches at Frankfurt. So that's going to be kind of a concern for me as we go through and talk about 686. All right, so on to the new changes. AoE stack farming is, to me, the biggest thing. We talked about how much the meta in the last 2 patches really centered around clearing those jungle stacks. That got a substantial nerf. The small Centaur and the small Hero Bear now have a stacking magic resistance aura. It only gives 5% magic resistance to heroes, but it gives 20% magic resistance to creeps. And what that means is, so if you just look at how the spawn works, on average, a triple stack large camp is going to have about 30 to 36% magic resistance on average, which is really obviously a huge amount, and it's a big nerf. to like a Shadow Fiend that's going to try and clear multi-stack camps with AoE raises. The camp positions got reworked. There's a new Secret Shop camp that can't be multi-camp AoE'd at all, so it's by the Ancients. But obviously, you can't do this little trick where you're going to pull multi-camps out and try and AoE them all because most Ancients are going to be magic immune. The Radiant hard camp number 2, the hard camp that was closest to the river, is no longer safely multi-stackable. It's now very, very close to the Dire Offlane. So first of all, the Dire Offlaner can now pull, but that's a camp that early in the game had been chain stacked for supports, by supports very commonly for their mid laner. That's really, really dangerous now. Dire is going to be able to contest those stacks very, very easily. This trend, as I commented, of the offlane meta opening up, I think is going to continue, and I still think you're going to see plenty of dual lanes in 6.86, although I do expect tri-lanes to make a bit of a comeback. There's a lot of other sort of moderate buffs to junglers in the early game. There are buffs to neutral creep abilities that I think really favor Chen and Enchantress early ganks. Smoke is a lot cheaper as well, which means that junglers and possibly also roaming tri-lane supports can be a lot more active around the map. And Iron Talon, interestingly enough, although it's only a 500 gold item, I think might end up being the most influential of the new items in 6.86. It does an active ability, which it has an active ability which does 40% damage to one creep. And this is the way that camps work. This is about 25% of total camp health. So you're starting with a 75% camp if you have one of these things immediately, and that's going to really increase, I think, the pool of viable jungling heroes. And I also think that there are some carries like AM and Medusa that were really not reliant on AoEs. We're relying more on physical damage and cleave to clear Kemp's Sven as well, that could indirectly benefit from a lot of these changes. AM in particular, I expect he was a beneficiary of some kind of indirect buffs in the last patch or two, and I think he's going to be very, very strong in 6.86 as well. So power creep has been a theme for a while of a number of the changes that we've talked about. 89 out of 110 heroes were changed in 6.86. I'm, of course, not counting Arc Warden, who was added. And really, depending on how you count things, at least 70 of these changes were either buffs or reworks intended to make the hero more viable, powerful. So way, way more buffs than nerfs. Several of the major reworks, you talk about Death Prophet with her Witchcraft, you talk about Lone Druid with her Synergy. They're basically now a built-in fourth skill. Those bonuses got pretty much built in to their other skills. They no longer require separate skill point investments. And each of those two heroes now have new skills, which in Lone Druid's case, I think is extremely significant in terms of the roles that he's historically filled and making him better at that. Pudge, if you look at that, basically gets his old Aghanim Scepter upgrade for free. So a lot of heroes coming into this patch are now dramatically more powerful. Really, the only two big nerfs were to Husker and Winter Wyvern, and there are some other heroes that, of course, got a bunch of minor nerfs on top of that, a lot of them centering around vision. But we really saw, adhering to this Ice Frog trademark, that most of the small to moderate changes were about increasing or adding to a hero's extant strength rather than addressing weaknesses. So, take a hero and make them even better at what they're already good at. And that's something that Ice Frog and the team have been pretty consistent now in terms of balancing Dota. Of course, just as a side note, we're definitely moving toward Aghanims for everybody here. It's now 84 out of 111, so like 75% of the heroes in the game now have Aghanim Scepter upgrades. There were 7 added in this patch. There have been almost 20 added since TI4, so that's definitely been a trend. And even beyond just adding Ags upgrades, you're seeing the existing Ags upgrades reworked and buffed to be a little bit more viable. So Vengeful Spirit, for example, is an example of one hero with an Ags upgrade that got a lot better in 6.86. This is something that I think is really, really beneficial to the game as a whole. We saw this in the last couple of patches, and 6.86 has continued this theme that quality of life improvements for supports are being taken very seriously by the team. I think this is just a great idea. The cost of boots of speed is less, meaning that supports get them a little easier. They're going to feed a little less in lane. In addition, it actually applies from both directions, that because the move speed on boots is also decreased along with the cost, poor supports are a little bit less crippled. One of the things that you would sometimes see, particularly in mid-tier pubs, is you'd see that offlaner get a lucky first blood and get boots early, and those supports just kind of became food in a lot of laning situations. So not only do supports get their boots earlier and easier, but they're also at less of a disadvantage against a core position player that has boots early. The Ironwood branch change, which I'll talk about a little later as well, I think it's a little clowny, the tree placement, but it's nice for supports in that they get almost a guaranteed juke early game. Fairy Fire is also a little bit of an anti-dive deterrent in that you get that burst 75 HP heal. We've already seen a couple of laning matchups that have been really affected by that. I don't know how many supports you're going to see actually buy Fairy Fire, but it's a nice sort of option in a lane where you know or you suspect that you're going to get dived a lot under your tower. The AoE placement indicator on wards is just something, this is my favorite change in the entire patch. I think it's long overdue. It's going to make it a lot easier for people in the mid to low tier brackets and pubs who want to learn that art of warding and dewarding. And there were actually a lot of pros that I talked to that were really positive about this change as well. So this is something I think is really, really good. Anything that you can do to make some of the more subtle and interesting aspects of Dota more accessible to more of the people that play the game, I think is just a huge, huge gain for the community at large. The courier cost got decreased again, and you've seen this in the last couple of patches where wards now stack. They don't take up as many inventory slots. Wards are cheaper. The flying courier, actually, this wasn't the flying courier now that I'm looking at this. It was actually the regular courier cooldown that was increased to combat courier feeding, but same thing. I think that was a really good change. And I actually think that the halving of smoke costs from 100 to 50 gold is potentially very important. It was Mad that pointed out to me the other night that despite the fact that in high level play, it's the cooldown on smoke that tends to be the limiting factor rather than the cost, this actually in certain matches is going to effectively mean a cooldown decrease as well, because it's going to be easier for supports to stockpile smokes in their inventory or in their base stash toward the beginning of the game. So I think this is really nice in that it's also going to enable those junglers and tri-lane supports to be a little bit more active early game, as we talked about before. And again, I think these changes are just really good for the game as a whole. So a couple new items that we haven't talked about explicitly. The Aether Lens, which the big feature is the plus 200 cast range, I think is just a great support item. It could very easily become the new Glimmer Cape. It's comparable cost to Force or Blink with a much better build-up. Again, the fact that you can build arcanes, disassemble them, buy a casual cloak, and you're now a ring of health away from an Aether Lens is, I think, that something that makes it really, really attractive to more supports. I also think you'd seen a lot of supports going Tranquil Boots for the health regen, and I think this is going to allow a lot of supports to buy the Aether Lens early on for that cast range increase, and then maybe even go into phase boots so that support positioning in the mid and late games is going to be a lot more forgiving. Notice this does not affect the radius of AoEs, but it does affect line stun. So Fissure, Impale, Earth Spike all get better from this, and I think those are three heroes in Earthshaker, Nyx Assassin, and Lion that are really going to benefit from this item. Dragonlance, on the other hand, I think is almost exclusively going to be a core item. It's an item that uses Ogre Club and Quarterstaff, so it gives you really good stats, gives you a little tank ability, attack speed, and damage, and it can be disassembled. So I think this is going to be super strong on ranged Agi cores like Drow, Gyro, Luna, Mirana that can build this on the way to getting their BKB and Butterfly, and I also think it's going to be very good on certain int semi-carries. Enchantress Huntress is the obvious one because the range increase stacks with her Aghanims for impetus, and you can now throw spears from just this ridiculously long range. But also Quap, Invoker, and Storm Spirit can get this on their way to Orchid and BKB. And if Storm hadn't been nerfed into the ground in the previous patch, I actually think this would be a really, really good Storm Spirit item to let him get those stacks of overload off with shorter jumps in fights. So in terms of heroes, I think the biggest beneficiary, Pudge and Invoker, just got huge individual buffs. And I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, the solo mid meta had stagnated a little bit at the end of 6.5. This wasn't as obvious because you'd been seeing mid dual lanes a lot more than you saw them in the past. And so the fact that the solo meta was really down to Quap, SF, and only a few other heroes wasn't as prominent, but I think Pudge and Invoker both. Pudge may still be more of an offlaner than a mid, but I definitely think Invoker is back as a viable mid, and I think you're still going to see Lina and some other heroes, so I think that meta is going to stay nice and open. Lone Druid, in my opinion, provided he gets added to Captain's Mode in close to his current form, is definitely a viable offlaner again, and of course the list of jungle heroes, all getting those global buffs with the camp structure, as well as to varying extents individual buffs, both their abilities and their items. I think junglers are definitely back. There are some physical damage based jungle farmers like Lycan, AM, and Medusa that I think are really going to benefit from these changes. I think partially as a result, Rat Dota as well as Tri-Lanes could make a little bit of a comeback. And I do think the offlane meta is going to continue to open up, which is really good. That was by far my least favorite part of the 684 meta was almost exclusively the Clockwork and the Earthshaker. So I still think you're going to see Slaughters despite the nerf, and I think you're going to see a lot more heroes in that offlane role, especially on the Dire side. All right, there are a couple of changes, and I want to reiterate, overall, I think 6.86 is a great patch. I think most of the changes are really good. Earth Spirit and Oracle in Captain's Mode, I'm not at all sure about. Earth Spirit in particular, I think has the ability to just draw matches out so much with his Aghanims upgrade. I think he becomes, you might see a little bit of the techies problem with him. The faction balance is something that I'm going to be very much keeping an eye on. I think Radiant being nerfed was necessary for pubs. I think it might be problematic for pros. The Faceless Void rework is just very weird, and the Iron Branch placeable trees is something, I think it's a cool idea, but I think it might get a little bit clowny in most games. All right, thanks for listening, guys, and I will be back soon.